Hi, this is Mike Gantt, and today I want to give you an overview of a book I wrote titled The New Testament from a Distance. I'll explain that title in a minute. I wrote the book sometime prior to 2016. I think it was pretty close to that, certainly in the 2 or 3 years leading up to that. And it's available on my website, and just go to jesuschristinthebible.info and you'll find my website and look for the library and the connection to the books, and you'll be able to get it. It'll be in a PDF form that you can read online, or you can download it to a reader like Apple's Books app, I forget what they call it, or the Kindle app, or you can print it out. Some people have done that. And today, as I say, is an overview of this book. It's got 21 chapters, and I'm going to use the table of contents to remind myself of what was in it. Wrote it almost 10 years ago, but I reread it recently, and I wanted to share it with you. Chapter 1 is just an introduction. Chapter 2 is titled, What is the New Testament? And I introduced the idea of viewing the New Testament as something, you can view it as part of the Bible, and it is a part of the Bible. It's an inextricable part of the Bible. It can't really be removed from the Bible, but you can recognize its history and how it came to be. And it came to be in a very different way than the Old Testament came to be. The Old Testament came to be in that God had established Moses to create a nation out of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were slaves in Egypt, and God called Moses to lead them out of Egypt, out of slavery, into nationhood. And Moses wrote 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. First 5 books of the Old Testament, of the Bible. And Moses died, and then Joshua took over. And after Joshua, there was a period of judges, which included Ehud and Samson and Deborah. And then after that, Samuel became a priest, and he anointed the first king of Israel, who was Saul. And that began the kingdom of Israel. It had been the nation of Israel before, but Samuel started writing. And then, anyway, you get all these books that are written. Joshua wrote a book. Samuel wrote the book of Judges. And so these books just get added to each other. So it's like when America was founded. We had the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And these documents are treasured because they're the nation's founding documents. But then other documents got added. Like America, we had the Federalist Papers, and then there would be the proceedings of each Congress and that sort of thing that get added to them over time. Well, these books of the Bible became very big, and now they total up to 39 books in the Old Testament. And so they just were added to Moses' books. Moses' books started the collection, and then a prophet would either write history or write prophecy, and those were added. David wrote a bunch of Psalms, and then you had a Psalm book, all added in there. And those prophecies prophesied of Messiah. So that's how the Old Testament was built up. But when the New Testament came along, it wasn't a nation. The gospel began to be preached in Israel, but it very quickly, Jesus led his apostles. He was from heaven. He led his apostles to preach into all the world. And so he had told his disciples, make disciples of all the nations. And they originally thought that meant the Jews in all the nations. But Jesus really meant all the nations should be disciples. So he told them to preach. He didn't say anything about writing. He didn't say, like, okay, Matthew, I want you to write a gospel, and Peter, I want you to write a couple of letters. He didn't do that. He told them to go preach in all the world. But in the course of their obeying that, they wrote, and it ended up having 27 different documents that they wrote. Only 8 of them wrote things that we have: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Peter and Paul, James and Jude. And so you can look at the New Testament. I'm getting back to what I was saying earlier. You can look at the New Testament as sources from history. Just like you might study the letters of Robert E. Lee to learn about Robert E. Lee. Well, you can study the writings of these apostolic men to learn more about Jesus. They are the primary historical sources for the life of Jesus of Nazareth. So anyway, I just introduced that idea at that point. Chapter 3 is titled Ancient Literature Accessible to Modern People. So the New Testament is accessible to us because people take great pains to not just translate it, but make sure it's got punctuation. You know, ancient texts didn't have much punctuation, if any at all. They just printed block letters. They didn't have spaces between the words or between the sentences. So the punctuation has been added, and then things like red letters for the words of Jesus. When the ancients weren't writing down in red letters. Matthew didn't write in red ink. So the chapter's about how modern people can understand and consume ancient literature. Chapter 5, more about the accessibility of the New Testament. And then in chapter 6, I lay the foundation for the stages in the history of the New Testament as a text, as opposed to as a part of a holy book. And then the next chapter, 7, it jumps to the final stage, acknowledging the one collection. And that's from the 4th century onward. It took to the 4th century to get a complete New Testament with the 27 books that we have in it right now. Why? Because these 8 men who were writing, they were all over the world, writing from this place and that, and they were writing based on certain needs that they had. And they weren't writing for posterity per se, or at least it's not apparent from what they wrote. They're writing to each other, because if they were writing for posterity, they'd explained a lot more things than they did, because we read them and sometimes we're scratching our head. But it took to the 4th century. All right, so why did it take that? So I spend the next, bunch of chapters going through why it took so long. I talk about the distraction of religion. I talk about the fact that all 27 texts were written in the 1st century. That's the 9th chapter. Then I talk about the age of formation, which is the 300 years between the 1st century and the 4th century. Then I talk about the drivers of formation. I identify the specific factors that caused it to take so long. I've already mentioned one of them, that these writings were spread all over the place. Another factor was there's no printing press, so you couldn't mass produce copies and get them around to everybody. Every copy had to be handwritten. Number 3, there was no central controlling authority at that time. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, churches did not have a hierarchy. There was a hierarchy, say, within a city like Rome or Corinth or Thessalonica would usually have and I'm talking about after the apostles died, would have a bishop who'd be in charge of all the churches in that city. But that was it. There was nobody in charge of the whole thing. It wasn't until the 11th century when the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek or Eastern Orthodox Church parted company, where the churches in the East went one way and the churches in the West, the Roman Catholic Church, went the other. There were other reasons why it took so long as well, and I go through all of those. And it's just amazing that it all came together. Then I talk about the values that prevailed throughout the formation, and one of those was there was a keen interest at all points in that who authored these things, who authored these texts, who wrote them. And I've emphasized that because in our day and age, modern scholars and modern biblical scholars are governed by a historiography, which is called historical criticism. And we don't have time to go into all that right now, and I only covered a little bit in this book, but it has, led them astray, just like higher education has led astray on a lot of things lately, right? Isn't higher education where most of society's wackiest ideas come from these days? So we knew when they put this together, they told us who the authors of these books were. But if you go to Bible professors today, a lot of them will tell you, oh, we don't know who wrote them, or they'll talk about the 7 undisputed Paulines, meaning 7 letters by Paul that everyone agrees were by Paul, but none of the rest were. So they're saying there's at least 20 authors in the New Testament, or 20 texts in the New Testament. We don't know who their authors are. Well, that's wacky, because we've got, the ancients, when they passed down the writings, they told us who wrote them, because they would know, because these apostles and their assistants were writing to these congregations who believed them. They would go into a town and preach, and the people that believed them became a congregation, and they called that a church. And it was very much like the synagogue that the Jews had, except that they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and of course the Jewish synagogues tended not to. But a lot of times the very first church in a city would be the Jewish synagogue, where the Jews there believed, because Christianity in the beginning was a Jewish sect. It was a form of Judaism. I've got a chapter on the distraction of canon. I go over the timeline of the formation of the New Testament, or the formation of the canon. Canon just means it's like if people talk about the Beatles canons, they say, is that song in the Beatles canon? And like you could say, what's that? I hate to even mention it, but that John Lennon song, Imagine, is that considered in the Beatles canon or not? In other words, the Beatles list of songs that they are responsible for. So the New Testament canon is, all the books that belong in the New Testament canon. I talk about the ancient verdict on authorship, which I've already been talking about, which is the authors were all determined in antiquity. I talk about modern challenges to the ancient verdict. That would include the kind of Bible scholars I'm talking about. One man particularly prominent is named Bart Ehrman, very well known, sold a lot of books, a very popular writer, very wealthy man as far as Bible professors go. But he's really done a lot to discourage people in believing in the authors that antiquity told us wrote the Bible. I think I mentioned in the book, The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. A lot of people have either read that book or seen the movie or both, or maybe even one of the sequels to the books or sequels to the movie. But in the original Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown, the author, in his writing, he indicates that, or proposes that the books in the New Testament were decided by Constantine, or else his staff of counselors, or else he instructed the bishops what to do. And that's just, there's nothing historical about that. And of course, Da Vinci Code was a novel, but it's one of those historical novels. So people who read the book, they expect that to be true. So like if you watch the movie Titanic, there's this romance story that everyone knows is fiction, but the fact that the Titanic actually sunk, that's actual history. So a lot of people just assumed that what Dan Brown said about the New Testament was true, that somehow there was a conspiracy to determine what books went in the New Testament. And there was no conspiracy. It was one of the most public processes you'd ever want to see, far more public than normal. Like, you go to the library or the bookstore and it says, okay, such and such a book by so-and-so. You don't sit there and like, did he really write that book? I don't know. How do I know he really wrote that book? Maybe it's a forgery. You don't do that. You just, the author goes to the publisher, presents the book. The publisher said, hey, this was written by, Sam McGillicuddy, and off you go. Now, once in a while there's a forgery, but you expect people to root those kinds of things out. Well, they had forgeries in ancient times as well. And when they had them, they dug them out and eradicated them. So a lot of books tried to attempt to be by apostles, but it turned out that they weren't. In fact, there were over 100 books that were rejected from being included in the New Testament. Only 27 actually got in because there are that many counterfeits running around. So that's a very quick overview of the New Testament from a distance. Now you see why I gave it that title, because I'm not talking about the New Testament like having it open and reading it, but I'm talking about, okay, before we even start reading it, what do we know about it? And what we know about it is that it was written by 8 men who wrote 27 different documents. They all come the first century. And if you know that when you read it, then you can get a lot more out of reading it than if you're reading it thinking, we don't really know who wrote this, we don't really know when they wrote it or what they knew. This is better.